Hello and welcome back to Earth Science. We've so far in chapter 1, we've kind of gone over the basics of what Earth science is and why Earth science is so important and how these big spheres and systems work inside of our planet. In our second chapter here on the nature of science, we're going to go over just some basics on how scientists go about solving problems, the tools that we use, and how that specifically applies to Earth science. So the first part of this is science is done using a very, reproducible, very methodical kind of process we call the scientific method. And it's an organized approach for answering questions. There's two kind of things that are important that we need to happen in order for the scientific method to work. And the first is that events in the natural world need to have causes. When it rains, there's a reason that it rains. When we have a volcano erupt, there's a reason that a volcano erupts. There's a cause to that. And the second thing is it needs to be uniform. When it rains, is it raining because of the same reason every time, or is there something different? So these fundamental laws of nature are operating the same way at all places and all times. Gravity doesn't stop working just because you're in India versus Idaho. It's always going, it's always working. It works on the moon. It's a little not as strong, but it works on the moon. It works anywhere that you are. So the steps of the scientific method is number one, you need to observe what's going on. You need to see a natural occurrence and question the why behind it. Like, why is it that it rains whenever it gets cold? And then you have to form a hypothesis. Well, I think because it's getting colder, that evaporated water that's in the air is condensating and it's getting too heavy to stay up in the air, and so it falls down to the world. That might be a hypothesis for why it rains. Another one might be that, the sky produces water when it's angry. I mean, it's not as plausible, but it's a hypothesis. You could make a prediction that if every time it gets cold, it's going to rain, or every time you go out and yell up the sky, it's going to rain, and you can test it. You can run an experiment, and you can measure the water humidity, the humidity of the air. You can measure the temperature. You can measure lots of different things there. The time between rainfalls, and then once you get all this data, you can analyze it and actually find findings and report what's going on. When we collect data, most of the times we're going to be measuring a variable, and we're going to be looking at the dependent variable. This can be either qualitative or quantitative data. Quantitative data is going to be the one that science likes a little bit better. We like data that can be measured, that has an actual number attached to it. Like if, for example, we're measuring how much sunlight affects a plant, how wide those flower petals open is going to be our dependent variable. That's going to be dependent on how much light that plant gets. Usually the independent variable, the one that we're measuring, is the one that we control inside of the lab. And when we analyze data, our goal is to determine, is this data accurate? And could we do this data again? If we ran the same experiment over again, will we get the same results? So once we've ran our experiments and made our observations and make predictions, we can draw a conclusion. And is our hypothesis supported? We can't ever prove a hypothesis, but we can disprove them. So science is basically like making a hypothesis and then trying to figure out if we can break it. Like, can we find somewhere on the planet where gravity doesn't work? And with every test that we run, we either support that hypothesis or weaken that hypothesis. So if your experiment works and it gives you the results that you were looking for, your hypothesis is supported. Part of science and part of the scientific community is once we've made this breakthrough, we communicate it. We share it so other scientists can learn, they can ask new questions, run new experiments, form new hypotheses. This is how we've gotten here today. Isaac Newton said, "I have seen further. It's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants," and we have his shoulders and lots and lots of scientists before us to stand on their shoulders and continue that line of reasoning and figure out more about our natural world today. The last step on the scientific process should be publishing a paper. This is where you publish your findings, your peers can look at it. Those are experts in the field who If, let's say you're posting a hydrology paper, you're going to have other hydrologists look at it. Probably not astronomers. It's not unheard of, but they're not going to be the ones who are interacting with your research as much as other hydrologists. And they'll critique it. They'll give you, feedback on about what's good, what's bad. But then at the end of the day, they are going to determine whether that experiment can be replicated. Can we do that again? Does that work in Idaho at a hydroelectric dam? Will that work in Mississippi at a hydroelectric dam? We need to make sure that these scientific findings and these papers are reproducible. And one of the things about the scientific method is it's not linear. I mean, if everything goes according to plan, the first time, you go straight down and you get to communicate your results. Now, that usually doesn't happen. Usually something will not work with your procedure. You'll need to troubleshoot and go back up and run your experiment again. Or you'll get data that doesn't quite say what you wanted to say. So you'll go back up and you say, did I ask the right question? Was why does it rain the right question? Or why does it rain when it's cold a better question? Which one is what I'm actually testing? What is my experiment actually looking at? So, and sometimes you can go back through this process 4, 5, 6, 7, 300 times until you finally get to that communicate results part. Now, you might have heard of scientific laws. They're a little bit different than hypotheses. These are usually generalizations about really, really big concepts. So these are concepts about lots of hypotheses put together. So with the gravity, does gravity work at night? Does gravity work during the day? Does it work the same in Idaho versus in Indiana? Does gravity work for all objects the same? These are many, many different hypotheses that we've tested, and we've found no exception where gravity doesn't work. There's no place in the universe that we've discovered that gravity doesn't work. But these laws that we're making in the scientific community, we're not creating these laws. They're already there. Gravity's already working. You don't need to understand gravity for gravity to work. It's just working all the time, whether we acknowledge it or not. So we don't create these laws, we discover these laws. There's lots of tools that the earth scientists will use. For geologists, they'll use these things like this rock hammer up here in the top right, which is able to break apart rocks and crush rocks and separate rocks out from each other with that kind of longer, pointier end. We use things like drills and augers to sample materials that are under the ground, do a lot of soil sampling. Usually we'll take these samples in cloth bags and examine them back in the laboratory. Usually earth scientists are going out and getting a lot of their data in the summer and then taking it back into the lab in the winter and analyzing it during the winter. Of course, exception to that is people who study ice. They're going out in the winter and getting ice cores and keeping them in really cool, big freezers for studying them all summer. So it's kind of that opposite of you got to collect your material when it's there, when it's available. Some other tools. On the top here, there's a crusher, which is used to take these really big chunks of rock and crush them down into smaller chunks, or more of a fine powder that allows you to test some things about them a little bit easier. We have a caliper over here, which is used to measure irregular objects, their size, very, very accurately. And on the next slide, I have a picture of a sieve, which is used to sort sediments out by size. And as you can see here, these sizes are one quarter or one quarter inch smaller, and then they get smaller and smaller progressively, the holes do. So you start out with these really big rocks and sediments, and then each layer you're taking out one size until you get to the bottom and you have the smallest size available. Some other tools, these ones can be used in lots of different forms of earth science. Laser finders we can use to find stars, we can use to find heights of mountains, we can use to find all kinds of information. Clinometer is used to how much slope is on a mountain. Seismograph, this picture here on the bottom, this is to examine earthquakes. And earthquakes tell us a really nice story about what the inside of the earth looks like and what underneath of us looks like. So without this seismograph, we wouldn't have that really, really nice information. And now we can also start to predict earthquakes and when they're going to happen and prepare for them better. So some other things we use to study the sky and the stars. We use thermometer for temperature. We use an aerovane for wind speed and direction. And we use barometers to measure air pressure. Air pressure tells us a lot about what the weather's going to do, about what kind of fronts are coming in. Is it a hot front, cold front? Is it a lot of heavy air? Tells us a lot about that. We're going to talk a lot about that when we get to weather. And some other things for the stars and the sky. Telescopes help us study planets and stars. The more we know about the natural world, the more we know about our planet and the world that we live in. And we use satellites for every single field of Earth science. We use them to see Earth, we use them to make maps, examine the ocean floor, to discover and explore other planets and moons. We use satellites for GPS, we use satellites for a lot of things in Earth science. They are kind of like the new and revolutionary and just awesome tool that gives us so much information very, very quickly. Instead of having to send air balloons up all the time, we can see big storms forming and we can see them traveling and we can track hurricanes and tornadoes and look at volcanoes and do all these things that we couldn't before, or that were really expensive to go do because you had to travel there. And now we have a satellite that can look at it from the sky and kind of help us out there and make it a little bit easier for us. This is the end of chapter 2. It's a short chapter. It's just a nice chapter about all of the tools and processes that we as earth scientists will use. We'll be using some of these in class when we do our mineral lab. But I hope you enjoyed this chapter, and I'll see you in the next one.